tia kia urupuru tia kia mau. Tia mai te tau uru o te rangi ka tīnā ka ue nā ka toko te manawa ora. A tīnā toko te manawa ora ki ue, a tīnā toko te manawa ora kia rangi nui e tū nei kia o papa e ta koto nei ka uru ora. Ka uru ora o ki te wenua, ka uru ora ngā tāngata, ka uru ora o ki te marae, ka uru ora ngā rākau. Ka uru ora o ki te rangi, ka uru ora te atua, ka uru ora. Ko te waka uru ora ki te kaununuku, ko te waka uru ora ki te kaununui, ko te waka uru ora ki te kauroroa. Oi e uru ora e wai au e ao marama. E rongo waka iri ake ki runga turu turu o, witi waka maua kia tīna, tīna, hui e, tai ki e. A kauri taku waro kia rātou kua eke atu ki ngā tai o te pō ki te tai wakarunga. A ko rātou rā ngā kaipupuri i te mana me te aro a mā tātou te unga ririki. A ka tika anō ka tuku ngā wakaaro atu ki a rātou e tā koto nei roto i a rātou kāinga e waangu. Ngā tini mate o te motu e a kurau kura ki te pō e whakarere atu rā. A ka tika rā ka pupuri tonu mātou i ngā kupu o a ki o rātou mā nā te whiti o rongo mai te ki. A ko te pō te kai ari i te rā, ko te mate te kai ari i te oranga. Ka ki tō tika mai au ki tēnei rangi kiko kiko ki te tukunga me i aro a ki runga i a koutou katoa kua tai mai tēnā tatau. A kauri taku aro ki tūrakira i piki atu ki tā poko ki pāpata iki o rongorongo. Ka arere te ka umau ngā ki puke atua ki te wakapūware te wa Aotearoa. Ia umai te waimanga i rua tūpua i rua tāwito ara ko ngake rawa ko wai tai tēnā. Ka puta ko te ara tūpua oronuku tūpua ororangi. Rere atu ki uta ki rimutaka ki tararua. Eke ki o ki parera o ki pō kai mangu waka uti atu ki pipinui. Ātea te tiro ki te rimurapa, o ki tō tika atu ki tūrakirai, a ko te mana nui o te papa e ora nei, e titia nei taku rau kura i te wēnua, ko te atia ua no runga i te rangi taranaki wānui, āruru ki te papa e tau nei. Āruru ki te papa e tau nei ki runga i te ara ākau o tūpua orarangi, ka tau mai taku manu wairua ki runga i tēnei wā i kerero i te papakainga tāwito o kumutoto, koutou rā e te wānau nau mai e rarau mai nei. Koutou rā no ngā au e toru o te motu nei, kua pupu i mai ki te tautoko tēnei au tuawā o te wanganui ātara, tēnei au o te tonga, tēnei ka mihi ake ki a koutou katoa, nau mai, whakatau mai, e rarau mai. Ka tika rā, ka tuku au ngā mihi ki runga i tēnei kaupapa o te pōnei, koutou rā i ngā kai kōrero o te pōnei, koutou i ngā kai toe, a tēnei kami i ake au kia koutou rā a konei ka tūno o mai ki ruto i inei tūru tēnā tātou, a kia kaa, kia maia, kia manawa nui, kia tau te rangi Māori e ki runga i a koutou, o tira ki runga i a tātou katoa. Nō reira, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā raurangatira mai ngā iwi o te motu nei ko taku raukura tēnei, e titia nei e te atiawa ai te tihi tera i me te katoa. Nō reira, tēnā tātou. Hello. Bilingual. Welcome. My name is Connor. I'm here on behalf of Taranaki Whānui ki te upoko o Tika. I'm mana whenua representative for this area. I was asked to come in this evening to be able to open up this event for this evening, which is my honour always. I will always acknowledge you guys, our speakers for this evening, those ones that will sit up here and debate under the umbrella of what we call the rangi Māori of the peace. Tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou, o tira, welcome. A little bit of what I talked about so that it's understood and not just a whole bunch of mumble jumble. Starting from the mouth of the fish on that side at a point called Tūrakirai, going up all of the mountains to Rimutaka, all the way back again, over towards Porirua, but not Porirua, round by Porirua. Coming back down again outlines the boundary of us, of Taranaki Wānui, 5 iwi, Ngāti Tama, Ngāti Mutunga, Te Atiawa, Taranaki Wānui, Ngāti Ruanui from Taranaki, o tira, ngā iwi katoa, all of the iwi from Taranaki, all 8. So I'm a representative of them, and it is my honour. I hope you guys have a lovely evening this evening, and then it goes nice and smoothly, and the kōrero is sustainable and has sustenance. O tira, I'm going to hand this over now to Peter. Kia ora. Yes, let's just give a big round of applause for this evening. Kia ora. Come on, Peter.
O ka pai and kia ora tangata whenua Taranaki whanui Conor McLeod for the mihi whakatū. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome and thank you. It's great to see such a good turnout this evening. We're here for a pre-election debate, probably the first one in the lead up to this year's election, so it's good timing. The theme of tonight is navigating global uncertainty, trade, aid and foreign affairs. And tonight's event is brought to you by the Council for International Development and the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. Special thanks for joining us this evening, particularly to our political panellists. I know you're very busy. To tangata whenua, distinguished guests, members of the diplomatic corps, invited media, tertiary students, colleagues and friends. And special thanks to members of SID and NZIIA for joining us this evening. My name is Peter Rudd. I'm the Executive Director with the Council for International Development. If you don't know us, we're the peak body for organisations working in international development and humanitarian aid. We're a members-based organisation with around 90 members currently operating in around 190 countries. We have large NGOs as members, such as World Vision, UNICEF, Save the Children, Fred Hollows, which some are here this evening, business, academic institutions, research organisations, other development actors. We connect, strengthen, advocate for international NGO sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand and internationally. We have a long-term partnership with MFAT. Institute of International Affairs are also partnering with us this evening, an independent, non-governmental organisation, members-based organisation as well. And both of us, our kaupapa really thrives around a collaboration, connection and thought leadership. If you're not already a member of SID or NZIIA, well, you should be. And here's an opportunity. There's plenty of staff here. You can reach out to us and ask about membership. There's different pathways for that. So being Wellington, health and safety is very critical. So in the case of an emergency, an alarm will be sounded. Please make your way to the emergency exits. The evacuation point is downstairs across the road, so go in an orderly fashion, please. Do not use the elevators and reach out to staff if you need assistance. Bathrooms are located directly out of the ballroom around to your right. So the format for this evening, I'm surely going to hand over to our moderator, Josie, and we're going to move through some Q&A, and we want to open discussion with our panellists. That will last for about 35 minutes, and then Josie will reach out to the audience so you can start thinking about your questions. We'll have a couple of roving mics, so you're welcome to sit or stand if you wish and ask your question to our panel. We're wrapping up around just before 7 p.m, and then we will be moving for some networking drinks and refreshments out in the foyer area. So our panellists this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome and thank you for joining us again. We have Dan Rosewarne here, who's relatively new to Parliament. There he is. Joined as a list member with Labour in 2022. And he spent most of his career in the New Zealand Army, so quite a fascinating bio. Deployments in Afghanistan. He's also done some peacekeeping missions in Solomon Islands. Was part of the disaster relief with the Christchurch earthquakes. And I think it's these experiences that shape his kaupapa and importance of equality, social justice. He sits on the select committees for finance and expenditure and foreign affairs, defence and trade. Golriz Ghahraman, thank you for joining us. MP, everyone will know Golriz with the Green Party. Been with them for many years. She's an Iranian Kiwi refugee, made history as the first ever refugee to be sworn as an MP, having arrived in New Zealand as a child asylum seeker with her family from Iran. She studied at Oxford, career as a lawyer, New Zealand and overseas, and this has focused her on human rights, holding governments to account. Our other panellist this evening is Honourable Gerry Brownlee, which I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with. Gerry Brownlee has been an MP with the National Party since 1996 and has a huge career with working in Parliament. In the fifth National Government, he was Leader of the House, Minister for the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery and Minister for Foreign Affairs. He's currently National Party spokesperson for Foreign Affairs, Emergency Management, GCSB and NZIIA. Welcome, Gerry. And last and certainly not least is Brooke van Velden. Brooke is a list member, Deputy Leader for the ACT Party. She's spokesperson for the Foreign Affairs, Health, Housing and Trade. She studied Economics International Trade at University of Auckland. And I understand she's contesting the Tamaki electorate, my old electorate in Auckland this year. So that will be fascinating to watch in that electorate. Representatives from Te Pahati Māori were also invited this evening, but unfortunately couldn't attend. Our panellist tonight is none other than Josie Pagani, and my predecessor at SID, down here in the white jacket. Sorry we didn't get your name badge, Josie. Josie works in geopolitics, aid, development and governance. She's a partner with a boutique public affairs agency and chairs the board of Fair Trade Australia New Zealand, which is one of SID's members, so that's wonderful. She was finalist for Best Columnist at the 2023 Voyager Media Awards. So I'm shortly going to hand over because you don't want to hear from me and you want to hear from our panellists. But I think this event is really important. New Zealand is operating in a more volatile, conflict-torn world. Globalisation is under threat, famine is on the rise, civil society is increasingly fragmented, and climate change is having a more severe negative impact. According to the latest World Food Programme report, over 250 million people are facing acute hunger, while economic shocks in the Ukraine war are contributing to further increases. You would have seen as recently as July 17th, Russia announced that it would not renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and this will further compound food security issues, particularly in Africa, where a lot of our members are operating. We're also seeing increased global security threats and power projection in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Our panellists tonight will share what they see as New Zealand's role on the global stage, their perspectives around international cooperation, aid, development and trade. And the event will also explore our position in the Asia-Pacific, how we can strengthen ties with Pacific Island nations and cultivate deeper partnerships. Thank you again, and I'll hand over to Josie and ask our panellists to please make their way up onto the stage and find a comfortable chair. You're welcome to take a seat anywhere you like. Thank you.
Everyone got a seat. No mai haere mai e te honga whakarongo, nā rangatira haere mai, me nā mema o te paramata tēnei haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Ko Josie Pagani te poingoa, and it's very good to be here. We were here 3 years ago. I don't want to alarm you, but this was the 2020 election. We had the same debate, and it ended up being the only live debate in that election because we went straight into another lockdown. So don't want to worry you, but it may not be over. So let's get straight into it, guys. We're going to have about half an hour or so of chit-chat and informal kōrero, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So just this week, this is what I was looking at today. Just this week, China has war-gamed amphibious assaults on Taiwan, bigger than ever. Taiwan has war-gamed China invasion. The US, Australia and New Zealand and 11 other countries have hosted what I call the Olympics of war games at the moment. It's the biggest joint military operation we have seen. And meanwhile, China and Russia are also doing their largest joint military exercise. And Belarus has just threatened Poland, and also North Korea let off a ballistic missile. So not worried at all. Gerry, let me go to you first. Are we on the brink of war, and do we know what side we're on?
Notwithstanding that very interesting sort of list that you've just read out, I don't think we are on the brink of war. I think there are tensions between countries that at the moment I think are not as well defined as we might imagine them to be. And I think the key to it all is that the interlink between the economies of so many countries around the world and that of China. And there's a sort of a fixation on China, which is justified for any number of reasons. But 143 countries around the world count China as their major trading partner. And if you think about the effects of that trade being further disrupted, or perhaps equally disrupted as we've seen with the Ukraine conflict, then you start to head down a fairly catastrophic path for a large number of countries. So I would prefer to think that we are not on the brink of war, but we are at a point where perhaps there is a reconsideration of where everybody sits. And I think the one thing that we should not do is move away from, in the first instance, the value of diplomacy. And look, you have seen in recent times the efforts from the United States and China to talk. There may be talks where they disagree, but nonetheless the doors are open and there is that discussion. I think that needs to continue.
Golriz, that's a hopeful vision, and a cliched way of putting it, we need China for trade and we align our liberal values with the US bloc. How do we avoid picking sides in this geopolitical fight?
I think it's absolutely essential that we do not pick sides. We are a Pacific nation. And actually, China has been in the Pacific for quite some time. It's not super new. The alarm is new. The alarm is justified. But I would say it's redoubled when we start to look at the other superpower coming in with the same sort of ferocity as they always do. It's the US. They come with their military show of force, and then we sort of have that pressure of coming in, taking sides with our so-called traditional allies, doing the war games with Australia and the United States. Well, actually, our select committee, and 3 of us who are on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee are involved in an inquiry into illegal and overfishing in the Pacific. So we've had the privilege of going to some of these island nations. The last one that I visited for that inquiry was Tonga. When you look at why Tonga is dependent on China and the presence of China in that island nation, a really important one, it's debt. Pacific Island economies have been collapsing for some time. They are grappling with the climate crisis. Their crises are different than the ones that the US and Britain and Australia want to solve, which is this trade war with China or the military competition with China. If we want to lift the Pacific, the mana, the sovereignty of the Pacific, we need to focus on the problems that the Pacific is facing. So we have those forums. We can push our allies and trading partners to alleviate costly debt for the Pacific, to emancipate the Pacific's economies, to lift the voices of the Pacific when they talk about their need for climate mitigation and adaptation, actually. So their problems are different, and I think taking sides absolutely silences the Pacific and sets us back as well, our independence, our principled voice.
Dan, let me come to you, but first, before I ask this question, and you're possibly the most qualified person in the Labour caucus to be here. You've served twice in Afghanistan, you've been in the Solomon Islands on mission, so it's great to have you here, and I hope one day to see you as a minister in these portfolios. But why is the Labour minister not here on this debate? You've got a room full of ambassadors, dignitaries, diplomats, Pacific representatives.
Actually, we should have acknowledged them.
Good question. So Nanaia Mahuta, our foreign minister, is currently in South Africa with some meetings over there. So you got me.
And we're very pleased to have you.
No worries.
Yes.
I think a couple of things to unpack there. Military conventional training is nothing new. We've been involved with the 5-power defence arrangement. I've been on exercises myself. With that, I've been joint warfare assessments where we do talk about and war game the Taiwan Straits scenario, and then also studying Russian doctrine as a young officer, talking about what that would mean for Europe as well. But the one thing that does concern me is around the upsetting of the equilibrium amongst the nuclear powers. Traditionally, China, during the Cold War, we were very responsible with their nuclear arsenal, had around about 30 to 60 nuclear warheads. When there was an arms race between Russia and the US, they stayed relatively stable. They were the only state with 4 nuclear powers on their border, so it was in their best interests to maintain the status quo. But what we're seeing now is an upsetting of their equilibrium where they're modernising their nuclear arsenal. And what worries me is if they move from a no first use nuclear posture to an asymmetric escalation posture where they would be prepared to use nuclear weapons first. And what that would mean for the extended deterrence that the US provides to the likes of Japan and Korea and things like that.
I think this is a problem, and I think that nuclear threat is an issue, but I actually think we disrupt the equilibrium by engaging in those old traditional take sides. I mean, who's going to say it? Cold War model.
No, it's not.
Let me come to Brooke, because Brooke hasn't had a chance to speak. I mean, Brooke, are we regressing to a 19th century model of might is right? I mean, the AUKUS announcement was made when the backdrop with a nuclear submarine behind it. So,
Terrifying.
Are we at risk of returning to an old model that didn't work and led us to war?
Look, I don't think we are, but what we are seeing is the fact that we have the Chinese Communist Party increasingly flexing their muscles. And your two options there are to do nothing or to do more. And I think it's important that New Zealand aligns with allies and traditional partners who actually share our values, the values of democracy and the values of freedom, because I would hope that at the end of the day, those values continue and remain rather than become suppressed over time. But I don't think it's a question of having to choose sides, because it depends what you're talking about. Is it choosing sides on defence, or is it choosing sides on trade? I would choose to side with our traditional allies on defence because they share our values. But when it comes to things like trade and improving New Zealand's livelihood and our economic opportunities, it's not a question of needing to pick a side. You know, I was just recently in Taiwan, and this is a country that you would expect has to show an awful lot of resilience when the person that's threatening them is literally on their own border. But for Taiwan, China is their largest trading partner. So they haven't needed to pick a side when it comes to trade versus defence. They can do both.
So is there a tension with National and ACT on this, Gerry? Like, I mean, you're less hawkish on China. You're less hawkish on China than others.
Let's be very clear. We don't have tension with anyone.
No.
We just have our view.
You're so nice.
Look, I think, you know, the thing that I keep going back to
Never been accused of that.
is, yes, you've got all these things going on. And, you know, Talisman Sabre, the big exercise that Golriz thinks we shouldn't be part of, that's been a big exercise that's gone on for literally decades. And it might be, you know, pretty big now, but, you know, it's just one of those traditional things, and it's appropriate that we indicate where we sit in any, should there be any conflict. I don't think we make any bones about that. Going back to China, you've got to look at some of the motivations that might exist there. And what keeps some of my thinking a little bit away from the possible conflict model is that the Communist Party in China came to power in 1949 after 12, 15 years of revolutionary activity driven by the poverty of the people and the uprising of the people because they were sick to death of living in that poverty. If you look at the progress, particularly in China, the progress since Mr. Deng, they have lifted literally hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty, not only in their own country, but in many others as well, as they have expanded that trade. But right now, as we sit here, there are 600 million people in China who live on less than $3,000 a year. So the imperative for the Chinese government is to keep on growing, keep on lifting people, and they talk about by 2035 another 400 million coming into what they call their middle class bracket. We wouldn't call it that, but they do.
But
no, look, hear me out, because
I will hear you out.
Okay, that's good.
Very quick.
You've just wasted a lot of time.
Just
with this.
quickly.
No, please.
Yeah,
Continue,
well,
Mr. Brownlee.
I am being quick. It's very important. So
be quicker.
They can't do that. And so for the rest of the world to say, well, look, you're over-flexing, you're getting too important for yourself, all the rest of it, think about what those motivations are and then work out how you deal with it, because it's not going to stop.
Is there a red line, though, that China, in terms of human rights, would cross that would make you not want to accept their money to build roads?
Well, firstly, let me tell you, that is just the most silly story that could ever have run. We're not about to invite the Chinese government to come in here and build roads, although, dear God, someone's got to do it. The question really is, what's our attitude to both our export market into China and our investment from China?
I do think, though, that there is a fundamental question here. When we say our traditional allies in defence share our values, does that include a nuclear-free Pacific? Because they do not share that value, and so that is an issue.
Yeah. So Dan, should we be joining AUKUS Pillar 2? So Pillar 2 is obviously the sharing of technology and so on. It's not the nuclear submarines, but does that undermine our? We're signatories to the Treaty of Rarotonga for the Pacific, which is a non-nuclear Pacific region. So should we be joining AUKUS Pillar 2? Your minister's talking about it.
You would have recently seen the released MFAT document about the strategy review, and it talked about the 3 shifts. And one of those shifts was a shift from rules to power, where we're going to rely on collective security arrangements a lot more than we did in the past. Now, our nuclear-free policy from '87, that's been entrenched into New Zealand society, and we'll not move away from that. However, I think there will be a review in terms of Pillar 2 and how we can align ourselves with our conventional partners, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and those new technologies. And how
that's a yes, we join.
So aligning with Pillar 2 is something that that is on the table.
Right. Brooke, do you think that the government, New Zealand government, should join AUKUS Pillar 2?
Well, look, I do actually think we need stronger security alignment with AUKUS. I'm in favour of us joining Pillar 2, but I also think, going back to Gerry's point about the roads, I actually think, because I do want to touch on this one. Look, I actually think we have to have bigger conversations about our own security and national security and our own defence, even within our own country. And one thing that has become increasingly concerning in the Pacific is the number of island nations indebted to the Chinese Communist Party.
Really
or
expensive
China.
debt model too.
And so I think it's important for us, for our strategic infrastructure, not to have
Brooke,
Chinese investment.
A quick follow-up. Active made it clear you don't want Chinese money to build roads, and we're not going to talk about roads because this is foreign affairs, aid and trade. But you've said you don't want to take money from non-OECD countries. India's a non-OECD country. Will you take money from India, investment from India?
Part of what we've said is that for strategic investments, in particular things like infrastructure projects, we would take investment through countries that are part of the OECD.
But India's not, so...
Well, that's right, it's not. So
so
it
you
wouldn't be
wouldn't?
part of that.
Okay.
But
Gerry.
that's not to say that we don't have investment in other areas. This is in strategic infrastructural projects.
Right.
We want to see more countries invest their money in New Zealand through opening up the Overseas Investment Act. Because I think we've made it really hard to send foreign capital to New Zealand, and that's holding us back from the rest of the world and our economic development.
Gerry, then Dan.
Well, we're bouncing around the topics quite a bit, but just ducking back to AUKUS.
We're getting on to aid in a minute.
And the so-called Pillar 2, I don't think anyone at the moment can define what Pillar 2 is.
No, that's
exactly
right.
We've been asking what it is, and you get vague things, with all due respect to what Dan had to say, people are saying AI and other technologies and everything else. We don't know, and until we know what it is, then why would we make any commitment or otherwise?
And you know who doesn't know as well is the Pacific. Nobody's talking to the Pacific Island nations.
Well, that was the other point, was on the Pacific debt. You've got to be a bit careful what you say, but the debt across the Pacific relative to New Zealand's annual aid budget, added to that Australia's annual aid budget, Japan's and the United States, it's potentially something that's quite manageable. And I think I would want to see New Zealand taking a stronger position in trying to sort some of that out, because we've sort of let it happen, that group of countries. You could add the UK in there as well.
We'll come back to the Pacific and aid, but Dan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the only thing I had to add was around, in terms of the Pacific, What we don't want to see is small island nations becoming pawns in a larger political game of chess amongst the hard powers. And I think New Zealand has a leading role in making sure that their voice is heard.
Although actually, Prime Minister of Fiji, Rambuka, at the NZIIA conference just a few weeks ago, said very clearly, we've been dealing with geopolitical tensions for decades. Remember the Second World War? You know, some of the biggest battles were fought in the Pacific. Actually, they can probably teach us a bit about how to handle this tension. So,
and we're not talking to them effectively. This is the key thing about AUKUS, I think, that we need to hold and take away from, in terms of foreign affairs, is that are we lifting the voices of the Pacific? Are we protecting their views on whether we should be joining AUKUS, whether they want that stuff in their territories?
So let's move quickly on to Ukraine and then into aid and more into the Pacific. And at Golriz, I'll start with you because your courage today, I want to sort of give a shout out to that over your challenge to the Iranian ambassador was really courageous. Now, talking about Ukraine, if I can sum up the Greens' position on Ukraine, it's basically, yes, Putin's a bad guy, we've got to do something, but we don't support lethal aid. We don't support military lethal aid, we want it to be humanitarian aid. How is that position different to Donald Trump's position?
I haven't spoken to Mr. Trump.
Good.
But I am worried that if he becomes president again and we join AUKUS, no, but that actually is a worry for me, is all of that information sharing stuff. We need to be careful. In terms of Ukraine, I worry that when there is such a clear case, Putin has absolutely breached the laws of war, the prohibition against all sorts of horrifying things, and international law, domestic law, everything. We're very clear he has invaded another nation and he's the bad guy here.
I sense a but.
But these types of cases make for bad precedents. We haven't had a debate in our nation about whether or not we need to join a war. So to send military aid, to send weapons, to join the NATO military operations, as we actually have, like, let's be clear, we are involved in a war because we're sending military aid. It should be a much more careful and publicly debated decision.
Can I ask you though, because the Green Party I know support the responsibility to protect principle, the R2P principle, which is about preventing a genocide or crimes against humanity as they are about to happen or happening. How do you do that without weapons?
As an international lawyer, I actually have quite big reservations about the responsibility to protect doctrine being invoked before it has been internationally defined. I fear that it will be a tool for what we've seen, which is superpowers dropping in where they don't like something, but then also protecting their own allies where they feel the need. So I don't think there's enough of a definition for us to invoke that. And in this case, we need to go back to actual international rules-based order. Yes, we send humanitarian aid. Yes, we acknowledge that there is now a displacement crisis that we need to aid with.
Would you ever send lethal aid? Or is the Green Party position a pacifist one?
Well, I do think that it would have to be debated properly in our democracy. We live in a democracy, and currently that hasn't happened.
In principle?
I wouldn't take an in principle position without looking at the actual facts, and I think it should be a decision, and the precedent should be that Parliament is involved in that decision.
So you're not a pacifist?
Personally, I actually am, but in terms of the Green Party, we abide by the rules-based order.
Dan.
I don't think the invocation of aid has been.
Dan, is Putin a war criminal?
Absolutely. So in 2008, with the occupation of Georgia, using those sub-threshold tactics and that deep battle doctrine, he replicated that in 2014 in Crimea. When he did it against Ukraine, the West was warmed up to it, and the one thing that the Biden administration did is leading up to that kinetic event was to tell the world about it. And so New Zealand, along with a lot of other partners, saw it in the news feed. It was probably the first war that we saw in our social media. And so I think the West was pretty much on board when that first tank rolled across into Ukraine.
Gerry, you actually shout out to you because you were actually pushing for sanctions and for the legislation for that right at the very beginning. Would a national-led government do more to support Ukraine?
I think at the moment the response has been appropriate for where we're at the moment. The question is, where's all this going to? And the harsh reality for us, and given your introduction, talking about a world that you could say is starting to fall apart, I don't share that view, but if there is a challenge to the rules-based system...
I don't want you to.
If there is a challenge to the rules-based system, this is what it's the catalyst for it. So he cannot win. That has to be the absolute position. It's the position that's taken by most of the countries in Europe.
Should we be sending more lethal aid?
Well, if that means that we have to do a few things more, then we would want to look at it. I'm not going to sit here tonight and say we're about to, go headlong into it. There has to be an outcome here that sees Putin defeated.
What's ACT's position at the moment?
Oh, look, we 100% support Ukraine. We don't believe any country should feel like they have a right to illegally invade another country and the rest of the world would sit back idle. It's about freedom and democracy. And
would
Ukraine
you support increased aid or of humanitarian aid and lethal aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what the ACT Party position has been from day one. We also agreed that we should sanction Russia from the get-go, and we put forward a proposition to the government in the hopes that they would take it up. For me, I want to see us align and stand alongside another small, liberal, like-minded country. And we have things like the Javelin missiles that are not in use in New Zealand, they're just sitting in a stockpile. That should be we should be sending them to Ukraine.
ACT supports 2% spending on defence?
We do, absolutely. It's part of our alternative budget and we've costed for it in another government.
What about the rest of the panel?
We'll be announcing our defence policy very shortly. But let me say just right now that the state of the New Zealand Defence Force is not tidy. We've got a personnel issue, a lot of people leaving, not the number of recruits coming through that you might like. It's partly pay, but it's also other aspects as well. Military leaders at the moment are wanting to do something. So even if you said magically tomorrow 2% of GDP is going to be spent on defence, you couldn't spend it in the next probably 2 to 5 years in any given year of that time. It takes time to build up. I don't think many people appreciate how far our defence capacity has dropped over years. So I had a plan as a defence minister for a very big spend over a long period of time that hasn't been continued. But once upon a time, just as an example, in the maritime space that we share with Australia, on their eastern side right out to our far eastern side, we used to be able to patrol around about 15 to 20% of that area. Now we're lucky to do 5%. And I think that's a capacity issue that we've got to deal with. So when you ask, are you going to increase military spending to 2% of GDP, it's somewhat of it's a question you can't just say yes and no to.
Because you need the capacity.
There has to be a longer term.
You can say yes and no to it though, because you can either fund it or you can't. And what we've been very clear on in ACT is that we would prioritise funding to make sure the funding is available for it. I'm still yet to wait and see how National would reprioritise any spending.
Do you want to go
make
Dan?
sure
I've
they
got
can
something
do it.
to say on this. Yeah. You go, Dan. Go.
I'm in charge of this.
Sorry.
Who's just not talking? Dan, 2%?
So I think what defence needs
Any
is some...
answer that begins with the word so is usually not
but
a yes.
just certainty, whatever number we land on, and there needs to be certainty for us to be able to plan. And I think every Western military has followed this. After World War II, when the strategic environment kind of petered off, and then the Berlin Wall fell, and then there was a unipolar international system. You know, we still had
Is
our...
that a yes or a no? For
Yeah, so we go on cycles in terms of our defence spending.
Yeah, got it.
And I think what we do need to provide is certainty, regardless of what number we land on.
So that wasn't certainty, though, just to be clear. Golriz.
I think that our defence spend is way too high, and it's because
My goodness.
we are spending it on war-making capability that is ridiculously expensive and does not go to the work of the NZIIA. We are responsible for patrolling 1/5 of the world's oceans, as Gerry said. Most of what we do is environmental monitoring, disaster relief. The Antarctic Institute upkeep, the travel, that's what our Defence Force does. So why do we keep buying the most expensive crafts? Because they are the biggest,
This is
they're
our
the
point
heaviest,
of divergence.
they have war-making capability, so we're wasting defence spending.
PNG,
Well, hang on,
PNG.
a good question would be,
Okay.
there has been purchases in the last
The
couple of years.
procurement has been
Hold
wrong.
on. No, well, we've certainly supported that and wanted to do
Of course
more.
you have.
Tell me,
You are wrong.
What bit of it, name the kit that was wrong. Was it the transport aircraft that can do disaster relief? Was it Aotearoa, which can do disaster
The
relief?
planes that we buy are so big because they have to be able to carry tanks
No, they're
that
not.
they
No.
can't
No, they
fly
can't.
close enough to the ocean
So I have a
surface.
question.
Can I be very clear with the audience?
I
New
have a
Zealand does
question.
not have a plane that can carry a tank.
So we've got. So you've
Ron
got.
Mark ordered it.
No, he doesn't have, not one.
It
He hasn't got
wasn't
one.
you. It
We
was
don't even have a
Ron.
plane that can carry a prime minister.
I think
so.
Clap for that.
Let me ask
I
you.
think the clue
Well, that was
in the name,
Josie
right?
saying we could buy a plane that could carry the Prime
We need to
Minister.
cancel the Ron Mark procurements, is all I'm saying.
No,
Papua
but-
New Guinea has just signed a security deal with the US, partly because they want support monitoring illegal fishing in the region. So that's something our Defence Force would do with extra spending, right?
Why does it need to be the Defence Force? That's a secular job. Like, we keep pumping money into the Defence Force to do things like environmental monitoring, but does that need to be with
Golriz,
a craft?
what do you think is the role of the Defence Force?
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
I was
you
going to
shouldn't-
ask.
Don't ask that,
The
Dan.
point's
We'll
in the
be
name,
all right.
isn't it?
The role of the, well, just because something has existed forever, the role of the Defence Force in New Zealand is not the role of the Defence Force in the UK, in the EU, in China. We are a Pacific island nation. Our Defence Force is responsible for environmental monitoring, addressing the climate crisis, adapting and mitigating the impacts of that in our region.
And then
so if we have to rethink...
signing security deals with other countries in
Yeah.
order to top up what we're not able
No,
to
no,
provide.
we will not
But-
be able to provide what China can provide. We need to join with our
is the
allies to
US,
lift
yeah.
the voices
Easy
of the
mistake.
Pacific. They don't want more war games. They need help with IUU fishing, yes. But what are our allies doing? They're turning up with war games.
Oh,
and
that
we
is
we
not-
have
that's
that
not
They're
link.
turning up with the...
Well, I
We
don't-
have
So
the
let
link.
me-
Yeah.
Brooke,
No,
Make
that-
that
that's-
difference.
that's-
I don't think
that's
that
not
is
fair.
right. I mean, Fiji and New Zealand just signed a new defence cooperation agreement.
Yes.
So clearly they do want help with defence in the Pacific Islands.
That's where
with
they've
New
been
Zealand.
wedged. What we
Golriz,
hear...
be reasonable. I mean, we had for 2 years one of our inshore patrol vessels on 3-month rotations. So they were there for 2 years, but different ships over that time, doing fisheries patrol out of Fiji. One of the things that you need to have the military involvement for is boardings. You know, don't make any mistake. If you're an illegal fisher and you've got millions of dollars worth of fish on board, and someone comes up alongside you, they are going to have guns and bombs and everything else because they don't want to be boarded.
Right.
So you do
Defence
have to have that
forces-
capacity.
No, we don't get rid of the
No, I want to
personnel.
move on to the Pacific now, and I want to ask you, Brooke. Well, we are in the Pacific, yeah, but you support 2% increase. Oh, it's 2% of GDP for defence. Do you support an increase in the aid budget? We're only at 0.27.
Exactly.
The aim is 0.7. Do you support an increase in the aid budget?
Look, my perspective on this is actually we do need to spend more on defence because I think that's really important, especially for the Pacific. Pacific Islands are crying out for it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen, like Solomon Islands signing their own defence security pacts, Fiji, other Pacific Island nations. I think we need to spend more and spend more time in the Pacific Islands with defence. With the overseas aid, we haven't budgeted for an increase But what I would like to see if we were to do that is actually a bit more scrutiny of where the money is going and whether we're getting good value for it. Because one thing that I'm hearing for a lot of New Zealanders is, oh, thank you very much. That's always nice. What I'm hearing from a lot of New Zealanders is a feeling that the government is spending more and more money domestically, but we don't feel like we get any more value as taxpayers for what we're spending. And I suspect the same sentiment would work internationally, making sure that if we are spending money and giving aid, that we are actually getting value and the aid is going to a good place. And one thing that I know people have concerns with is that we may be giving aid, but it's not being necessarily used to increase the values of freedom and democracy, but it's being used to help pay off loans.
Dan, you've been in government for 6 years, not you personally. You're the newest Labour MP, but Labour's been in government for 6 years. You haven't increased the aid budget. Why not?
Well, I think when you look at aid into the Pacific and my experience with the Solomon Islands, so we recently did a visit over there, and the one thing that stuck with myself and Gerry was you get off the plane, you go down the Aotearoa highway to the embassy there, and the aid programs that China is providing, the stadium, they've got flags up all over the show. New Zealand, Australia, Japan don't tend to advertise what they're doing as much, and I think that's something that we need to do a lot more of. The other one I'd like to touch on as well is in Tonga and in Aotearoa as well, you've got the US embassies that have just stood up, and they're large superpower, but they're essentially a start-up in those areas. And so I think working with the US, with our unique way of doing things and connecting with the community, is going to be critical going forward. And that was one of the things that I passed on to Daniel Crittenbrink when he came to New Zealand. And the first thing he did say was, how do we engage like you guys do? And so that was really reassuring to hear.
So, Gerry, I was in Tonga recently too, and one thing you hear in the Pacific all the time is stop telling us who we can and can't take money from. And so the attractiveness of taking money from China is that the Chinese turn up and go, what do you want? And they're able to say, well, I want you to build that or do that. We turn up and we go, we've got a great development idea for you. Listen to us, right? So my question is, are donors like us still driving the agenda when it comes to aid in the Pacific, development in the Pacific?
Look, you and I had some significant discussions about how we might change the aid approach when I had a role as Foreign Minister, and my views on that haven't changed at all. So the aid budget in New Zealand, I'm not sure what it represents, so I'll take your word for it that it's 0.7, but this coming year, it's just under $1.3 billion. And on top of that, you've got a $6.6 billion 4-year fund for climate mitigation as well. So there's a terrific amount of money there to be able to do some things. I think there is quite a difference, as you pointed out. And one of the things that sort of irritates me slightly, is in fact a great deal, is that inside that aid budget, that $1.3 billion, around about $150 million is spent on MFAT's own management of that budget. And I find that just extraordinary. So working more and in a better arrangement with NGOs and in-country organisations, I think is a focus that we do need to have. And if you look at that 25-point document that Foreign Minister Wang Li from China took around the Pacific, it was ultimately rejected, but it sits on the table as a possibility. The one thing that is most concerning of that is the 6,000 university places in China for Pacific Islanders exponentially over a 4-year period. So if you work that out, that's a terrific number of people. And we really need to be in the space with our partner nations of ensuring that the culture that currently is blended in the Pacific stays where it is now and doesn't change significantly.
Would a national-led government commit to the thing that we've committed to in international agreements, 25% of the aid budget being spent funding local NGOs, local civil society, local groups in country?
Well, that would be certainly my position if I was in that role.
Here's my next question. Foreign Minister or Speaker of the House?
Well, everyone talks about this. Everyone talks about that. I've read it extensively, and I see the author of a recent publication sitting at the back of the room. We did have a discussion. I made myself pretty clear to her what my view was, but then she apparently didn't listen to that and wrote something else.
So what's the answer?
Whatever Mr. Luxon asked me to do.
Right, very good.
And thank you for the concession that it's likely to happen.
Golriz, would you rather be Foreign Affairs Minister or Speaker of the House?
Attorney General.
Attorney General. Interesting.
No.
How would you change the business model of aid to make it more locally driven and less of a welfare beneficiary model?
So the 1.3 billion that Gerry has been referring to has been the climate finance.
No.
1.3 was for that anyway, so this might be separate.
No. The 1.3 is the 23-24 aid budget. The climate money comes out of the 6.6 four-year fund. It's an addition.
So we are very excited about the climate finance, I guess. My concern, and our committee did do a review of New Zealand's aid in the Pacific aid models. Gerry and I were on the committee last term when we did that. And so what did come back to us again and again was that the partnership model is the one that works best, and New Zealand is really good at that because we've been there for a long time. So absolutely that. But what frustrates me is that there is, in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I believe, there isn't a sort of cooperative approach to what we want to achieve. So when trade for aid comes up, they'll, trade trumps everything. Why are we even in a committee with Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade altogether? But, then we prioritise those trade relationships. We might prioritise China over some Pacific interests. We might prioritise the US in defence over some Pacific interests. They're not necessarily keeping in mind the idea that, we've got this $1.3 billion going into climate mitigation. Like, how are the oil subsidies in this free trade agreement going to impact the fact that we just committed to spend all of this money on climate mitigation? And these are issues that they brought up with us.
Yeah.
The Tongan government officials that we met with literally said to us, you're making trade agreements over here that put us at risk because you're still signing up to oil industry subsidies. They literally said that. And so we think of the Pacific as just sitting there, that, our Pacific backyard. They absolutely are not. They have the solutions and they can see us and what we're doing, and they do take issue with some of the ways that we kind of go off on our own.
Let me come to Brooke, but first let me just follow up on that. Here's something Samantha Power, who's now running USAID, she said that advocates of democracy have focused too narrowly on defending rights and freedoms and neglected the pain and dangers of economic hardship and inequality. Yeah. Is it unrealistic, and are we making it worse for countries like Tonga to say you've got to have net zero by 2050 and make your cars all EV? They've only got about 100 cars.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And I think that debt issue comes in really loud and clear on that. Because when you're crippled by debt, I think it's incredibly naive to think that Pacific Island nations are entering into defence agreements.
No, I'm talking about net zero.
No, I know, but those influences are there. So when they are suffering economically, they can't do what we need them to do with whether it's net zero. They can't not go into a defence agreement with China, even though we want them to. We come in and we kind of compartmentalise these things and we don't deal with them as a whole. To me, aid right now is not going to be enough for the Pacific. It has to be debt alleviation.
Brooke, let me come to you. What would you do, what would the ACT Party want to see in terms of a changed model for development? How would you empower Pacific countries?
I think the best way to empower anybody is through better trade, right? That's the way that nations have pulled themselves from poverty for decades. And it's the way that we've been able to grow wealth here in New Zealand and in other countries. And I think we have to stop looking at it as giving aid to Pacific Islands and thinking about how we can grow our partnerships so that we can help them help themselves over time so that they can stand on their own 2 feet without the need for monetary help from New Zealand, but we can actually have a very flourishing trade agreement and trade relationship.
Before we shift to trade, and I think we're getting we'll get quite Well, maybe we'll go straight to trade because we're running out of time, and then we'll throw it open to questions. But how would you, Brooke, how would the ACT Party suggest that we deal with the rise of protectionism, the fact that you've got the US basically saying we want to be as self-sufficient as we possibly can, which may well work in the US as a huge market, right? It's never going to work in a country like New Zealand, completely dependent on trade. How does New Zealand respond to the rise of protectionism?
Well, look, I think what in part people are responding to is the fact that under COVID, nearly all countries came to standstills. People closed down their borders, they closed down manufacturing, they closed down a lot of supply chains internationally, and it made it very difficult for a certain period of time. And we realised how reliant we were on other countries through globalisation. That has, in some ways, come back. You know, people are trading again en masse. But it also, with the, I guess, the geopolitical problems of Ukraine and Taiwan, China and Russia, has made us very wary of things like electricity supply and all of that. But I think on balance, most countries recognise that we are interconnected. And while there might be some aspects of feelings of protectionism, I don't actually think that's the way our world is going. I actually think we are global. We have globalised over decades, and it will be very, very difficult for countries to turn their backs on globalisation. I think we are interconnected, and the supply chains have healed and will continue to grow.
Gerry, two subsequent governments, an entire negotiating team, trade negotiating team and MFAT have tried this. What are you guys going to do different to what they've done to get a trade deal with India?
Well, can I just start too by saying that we've been very supportive of the EU trade deal, very supportive of the Brexit trade deal, Britain trade deal.
It's been a long week. It's been a long week.
No, that was accurate.
My apologies, Nina. I didn't get that. And they've been two very good agreements that have come out, and the EU one is likely to be ratified very shortly. So when you say the world is becoming more protectionist, that's not our immediate experience. The one country that is very protectionist is the United States, who I don't think have worked out just yet that perhaps their greatest tool, I'll say, for promulgating the way of life that we enjoy is through trade. You said, what would we do more for India? I'm going to say something now that will be a little bit provocative, because there'll be MFAT people in the room who won't like it. But I think we've neglected the potential of India for a very long time. And I'm not saying it was any better when we were in government. I think that was the case then too. And we need to recognise that you get good trading arrangements if you take time to get to know countries. And that means you have to have a good diplomatic footprint. We currently have a reasonable size, but not a very big High Commission there, and I think one consular office. We need to expand that network quite considerably. We need to have that flow of ministerial visits, trade missions, etc. And then we also need to get past the fact that every trade deal we have starts with how much dairy product can we sell you. India is one of the world's biggest service economies. Services are New Zealand's fourth biggest export, and it has massive potential to grow in this country. So we've got plenty that we can talk about, but it's the relationship stuff that you've got to do first, and that will be a very deliberate commitment from us.
Okay, right. I will actually come to you at the end, all of you, just to ask you to do a sort of 30-second sum up, but let's get to the audience with some questions. And I do please ask you to ask questions. They begin with usually W words, like what, who, where, how. Don't want statements or speeches, and I will shut you down if you do that in a very polite way. But yeah, any questions from the audience, please? Here.
Kia ora. Nick Henry from Oxfam Aotearoa. Will you stand with the Pacific with two things, if I can, but they're quick? Would you support the Port Vila call for a just transition to a fossil fuel-free Pacific, including at the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit in November, where there'll be a leaders' declaration proposed? Would you join that and support it? And would you commit to maintaining at least or extending, increasing our climate finance commitments beyond 2025?
But who was your question to? Sorry. It was
To
everyone. Okay.
To everyone, yeah, if we can.
So how about Dan? Do you want to have a go at answering that?
So both of those do fit within our remit and our overall strategy within the Pacific. So absolutely, that is something that we can look into.
Gerry?
Well, I think let's see what the Pacific Island Forum actually decides and what they put up. I'm of a strong view that we in Australia, and for that matter the US, need to do more to make that body have greater relevance in the Pacific. I think it's a good forum that needs to be used. So we would be guided by whatever that forum decides for the Pacific. Otherwise, we're getting into that paternalistic thing, saying you've got to have this, and it's not where we're at.
Yeah. Golriz?
Absolutely would support the remit if it's brought of a fossil fuel. Yeah. In terms of climate finance, yes, absolutely, we definitely need to increase it. But I do want to confirm that we do support Oxfam's call for that to go into the global fund, and we will do our bit in the Pacific also, but we do support the global fund in terms of climate finance.
Brooke?
Oh, look, I think it's really important to listen to our neighbours and understand their point of view. For me, it depends on how wide you're considering the Pacific. For me, we have set an act that we would be willing to overturn the government's offshore oil and gas exploration ban, for an example, because we actually don't believe that brought a lot of stability to the New Zealand economy, but it won't actually have any overall impact on climate change emissions. What we've heard from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was that offshore oil and gas ban was actually likely to raise international emissions because that production would now just happen in another country. So I do agree with playing our part in trying to reduce climate change emissions, but I don't think we should be so insular and look at ourselves and even the Pacific without looking at the global impact of what those policies would have on global climate change emissions.
And it is worth acknowledging that a lot of the UN citizen surveys polling that's been done over a number of years, what citizens in every Pacific country want, the top three things: jobs, access to health, and good education for their kids. Now, climate change sits over all of that, but if we're listening to the Pacific, it's quite it can be quite challenging to us as well in terms of what our priorities might be. Any other questions? Yes, in the pinkish, sort of Barbenheimer pink.
Hello. My question's mainly to Golriz, Gerry and Dan. Why
that's everybody but Brooke.
Yeah, no. It's a good reason. Why?
She's Dutch. It's
No.
Yeah.
Why did you guys not participate in the trip to Taiwan? And if another trip to Taiwan happened, would you guys participate?
Interesting question. Thank you.
I see why I was excluded.
Yeah. Okay, Dan.
It's actually really easy
Golriz?
for me, so I can quickly say we have a policy of not travelling in election year, so that was never on the cards for me.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So overseas travel.
That told you.
Yeah. But
Look, given that we're living at a very tense time and we're very close to an election, I mean, the same pressures came on us in an election year. New Zealand since 1972 has recognised the government in Beijing as being the government of China. And I think, for my part anyway, it was, I'm not really all that keen to poke the bear at the moment. I think we've got to be very cautious about exactly where we sit. Given you've got to remember too that, and I'm not. This will sound a little bit, potentially sounds quite weak, and I don't like that because it's not what I mean. But tomorrow there will be hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who go to work who have some dependence in their job on our trading relationship with China. So that's something that over time we have to deal with.
Dan?
Yeah, but I think that's a bit of a cop-out, to be honest.
Yes, well, I'm sure you do, but then, we'll discuss it over the cabinet table at some stage.
There are New Zealanders. There are New Zealanders constantly travelling to Taiwan. This was not anything.
Doesn't mean NZ industries
doesn't
in
mean
New
I have
Zealand
to.
are dependent on China.
What you're saying is you don't want to do a Nancy Pelosi.
Well, I think...
Did that really have repercussions, though?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on US politics. Well, what would you say? I mean, I'm sorry. No, I can't comment on it. Sorry.
I do have to give Gerry points for actually answering the question, because when his other National Party colleagues were asked, they just said it's an election year. So, well done for actually being honest.
Dan,
thank you, Brooke. I'll take that gold medal from you. That's great.
So speaking for myself, so at the time that trip came up, I'd recently been to Canberra for a security conference and had been to the US to do some security visits over there. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to be released to go over to Taiwan. And it was purely a timing thing for me.
I honestly thought we were all going next year. Like, I just thought it was election year when we were invited and we were all just going to put it off. I had no idea
that is the real cop-out.
Weird reason. No, I will go next term if I'm elected. I mean, I think we absolutely need to lift that democratic nation. It's in our Asia-Pacific region.
I was under the impression we were all going because my plane tickets were already
at
booked.
The airport, like, where is everyone?
Honestly.
Dan, would you go if you got an invite right now?
I think it's important to talk to anyone that asks who wants to have a meeting and discuss security issues. That's how we do business. We engage with everybody. So.
Questions? I'll get one from this side. How about this side of the room over here? Yeah.
Where's the women?
Just get Charlotte walking around.
So New Zealand has recently been participating in the International Seabed Authority's discussions on potential seabed mining regulations and been supporting a moratorium on that, which is something that I think I'm Peter from Caritas Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that's something that we and a lot of our partners in the Pacific feel very strongly is something that will be an environmental and humanitarian disaster, particularly for the Pacific, who won't benefit and will be harmed by it. This is a question for everyone, how will you, if you're in government, work to further New Zealand's stance on that matter, both with regards to seabed mining internationally and also with respect to our own waters?
And let me just add to that, what will you do then if, say, the Cook Islands want to do seabed mining? How are you going to juggle that? Dan?
Okay, I think I heard that question. This is my bad ear. It's my foreign shoulder, so sorry about that.
That's very macho of you, Dan.
So sorry about that. I think that goes back to the donor question, and where I want this to go is making sure that we get rid of the donee mentality, make sure that we recognise the mana of the small island nations that we're engaging with in a way that we allow them to convey their views, and then also that donorship is delivered in a way that doesn't come at the expense of their sovereignty. So that's not just donor, but then it's also discussions around seabed mining. Yep.
Gerry, National's position on seabed mining in the Pacific?
I'd be very wary of any outright support. I think that you've got to look at, so there's a proposal for the extraction of phosphates from the Pacific Rise a few years ago, the Chatham Rise a few years ago. The actual area that was going to be mined was relatively small compared to other places around the world where we currently get that product from. So I wouldn't rule it out entirely, but I'd also point out that, we wanted to protect the Kermadex, which is it's a huge area that does have a whole lot of those mounds in it that are very mineral rich. That legislation has sat on the current government's books for 6 years and hasn't progressed. And I think that's would have been a very big statement from New Zealand about how we viewed the ocean floor in the Pacific.
Quick answer. Golriz,
well, yes. I mean, I think you can kind of guess my Green Party answer, but
yes,
you did have the question about the Cook Islands, and I do think that's important. I think that again comes back to us having a sort of whole of government or foreign policy approach to the Pacific, where we can go, actually the Pacific Island nations don't want to abuse their environment, but if they are financially indebted to China with a very high cost loan, they may be more likely to be pushed into that position. And so we do need to lift the Pacific's voices in every way, but also to emancipate them financially.
Brooke?
Oh, look, I take a similar position to Gerry, not ruling it in or out.
Gosh, you guys should get together.
Can I just say, Gerry is a huge greenie, and it will become a shock to act.
He's very good at hiding
Be a
it.
shock to you, Golriz, but I'm also an environmentalist and a greenie.
I think everyone's a goddamn greenie.
Yeah. I'm a greenie and my wife's a greenie too. Yes.
With Nanaia Mahuta being the first Māori woman to be the Foreign Affairs Minister, she brought into Foreign Affairs policy making a lot of Te Ao Māori, and I would like to know how you plan to continuing this in the next government.
Fantastic question. The one thing that's a hallmark for the Pacific resilience policy is the Te Treaty principle of tino ranga tiatanga in terms of sovereignty. And I think that's had a significant amount of success in the Pacific to such a degree where other nations have undertaken moves to adopt some of those Te Treaty principles, and we've seen that with the Australian foreign policy strategy as well, with their First Nations foreign policy, and that's and we're working really closely with them on that. And then also with the US and what they're doing in the Pacific too, they're seeing the successes that we're having. So tino ranga tiatanga is one of those central tenets of our foreign policy. So we want to continue that.
Quick answers. Quick answers, and then we'll have some more questions. Go.
Well, I think, firstly, I don't think it's well defined. Te Ao Māori at the moment looks to me like a direction to put a lot of Māori concepts around, or basically wording around, various programs or whatever that MFAT might be wanting to run. If you look at the latest document, navigating what is it called? It's navigating a shifting world. It's got a whole lot of bilingual stuff in it. That's fine, but that's not Te Ao Māori. If you look at the changes that are occurring in New Zealand, you wouldn't have to go back too many years to come to a meeting like this, and you would not have the opening of the meeting that we had today. And I think it's the recognition that we are increasingly becoming a more culturally blended country than we have been at any time in the past, and that would certainly continue.
A couple of quick answers and then a couple more questions.
I think that Minister Mahuta's influence has been significant. I see that all the time. I wish that she was more free to bring that approach, so I would want to see that. I think, for example, if the government's current mass arrivals detention bill, which allows for an extension of the detention of possible sea arrivals, sat with her in her portfolio rather than immigration ministers and was looked at through a Te Ao Māori lens, there was no way that our first response to the possibility of people escaping war, persecution, climate crisis on a boat would be, let's legislate to detain them for longer.
Excellent.
And that's the substance.
Excellent deflection onto an issue that you wanted to talk about. That's very good. Brooke, quick answer.
Yeah, look, I personally think Māori culture is beautiful and we should be accepting and respect it. The difficulty that I've found in certain documents that have come out recently is this feeling that different cultures or different races of people should be given preferential access, not specifically in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but across industry and across government departments throughout all of government. And I think that's wrong. One area of the recent trade agreements that I thought was unnecessarily divisive and wrong was the idea of preferential trade access for Māori businesses. Now, I'm not sure you'd necessarily call that Te Ao Māori, but I don't think that that's right, and that's not what we should be trying to progress as a society, to say that people based on their race or their ethnicity or their ancestry should be given any form of preferential business access because of that. So absolutely think Te Ao Māori has a place in our society culturally, but but I don't think it has a place in our international documents in that way.
Thanks, Brooke. Right, okay, we've got a lot of really experienced and important people in the room. There must be some more questions. It's been great to have the ones we've got, but I'd like, there's a lot of students here. We've had a lot of student questions. Guy at the back.
Thank you. Corey Hawkins, RNZ Pacific editor. I have one question for the panel and a follow-up for Gerry. For the panel, we're seeing so many Western countries leaning on their Pacific, being part of the Pacific region and being a Pacific nation. Going forward for New Zealand, given that you are often pulled up on that narrative and often find yourself, as you say, having to divide your attention between your Western nation priorities and your Pacific priorities, would it be better for New Zealand going forward in its foreign policy to identify as in the Pacific but not part of the Pacific family in terms of navigating some of those tricky situations?
Okay.
And can I do the follow-up for Gerry?
Yeah.
Sorry, for Gerry, you mentioned concern about the education in China. There's a lot of Pacific Islanders going to be educated in Chinese universities. I just wanted to check in if you meant that that would mean a change in the way that Pacific Islanders coming into leadership, coming into roles of importance, think about their framing of the world, and whether that would mean that you see the policy going forward to be more scholarships for Pacific Islanders in New Zealand, Australian, American universities.
Okay,
Thank you.
that's two questions. Quick answer, Gerry?
Well, working back from that, I definitely think that between the US, New Zealand, Australia and the UK and ideally European Union, that we should have more scholarships for Pacific Island students. We should, at least amongst the group of us, try and combat that flow. There's no doubt in my mind that if young Pacific Islanders spend 3, 4, maybe 5 years studying in China, their acceptance or their perception, at least of the culture, will be altered, be different. And I think that's if you look at it, that's how the British Empire colonised the world. And they're just doing it reversed. I think we can do a lot more in that space.
It was not through scholarships.
Dan.
No. No.
Sorry.
But it was through forced influence.
Soft
no
power.
question.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to have a go at answering the second question? That should we identify as a non-Pacific Western country? Would that be a more muscular influence? No, it's good.
Yeah, what was the phrase?
Yeah.
I'm actually interested.
I just wanted to say whether calling yourself Bubale or Pacific family is problematic.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
The world, and whether you should go forward and just accept that you are different from the Pacific and you'll make it easier for you.
So, Dan, you have a go at answering that. What would be the benefit of that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, New Zealand is intrinsically Pacific. We've got 11 Pacific MPs. Our Deputy PM is Pacific. Our Deputy Speaker is Pacific. And then also the Chair of our Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee is Pacific. We have the largest metro Pacific city in New Zealand, up in Auckland. So I don't think we can get away from being a Pacific nation. And we should embrace that. We should make sure that, we leverage off that as much as we can.
Good answer. Any more questions? One last question. Yes.
I've been really interested to hear the discussion on the Pacific. I'd just like to say that New Zealand has some of the most restrictive visa processes for people coming from the Pacific to New Zealand, and I'd like the panel to. I'd be interested in hearing the panel's views on visa-free entry from the Pacific to New Zealand.
Okay, good. Thanks, Marianne. Marianne always asks the tough questions. So that's the last question. If you want to have a go at answering it, and then I'll ask you to do a 30-second quick sum up of whatever you want to say.
Well, my answer to that would be, I think we should look at that, and we should look at it in a reciprocal way as well, because there's quite a number of restrictions for New Zealanders going to spend time in the Pacific, particularly if they're retired and have retirement income, etc.
But enough about Murray McCully. Brooke.
You've been so well behaved up to that point.
No, I hope I haven't been too well behaved. Brooke.
Look, once again, I think it is an area that we probably should look into. But for me, I look at the Immigration Department and see a bureaucracy that's trying to keep people out. And I think we need to be far more accepting and open to allowing more people in and not seeing ourselves closed off to the rest of the world. So I think we need to have a huge immigration reset, not the one that the government's done, but actually saying New Zealand is a small country, more people should come here.
Golriz?
Funny you should ask that. So today in the Members' Bill ballot, a Green MP, Tiano Tuiona, had his Members' Bill pulled, which was to restore the rights of citizenship to Western Samoans, which was stripped of them. But and I think this links back to the previous question, which is yes, we I do think that we are a Pacific nation, but if we are going to call ourselves that, we have to, in substance, behave that way. And so the citizenship rights, the facilitating scholarships, all of that has to be part of it. We can't just kind of pop in and say that and then close off our borders or have dawn raids, for example. So.
What I'm going to ask you to do now is just sum up in 30 seconds anything you want to talk about the stuff that we've covered. We've covered a huge range of topics. And Dan, shall I start with you? Unless you want to default to someone else. This is a bit mean.
That's all right. So a quick 30 seconds. I'd just like to begin by saying thank you, because we do not discuss these issues as a nation very often. And I think the one thing that, if you look at those riots that were outside Parliament last year, and the one thing that unites us all is probably nuclear non-proliferation. We could probably all agree on that, and we could probably all agree that that we should be working together with our overseas partners. And we need to get a bigger dose of these conversations going on in New Zealand society. So thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Dan. Gerry.
Look, I don't share that. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well done, Dan. Sorry, I don't share the bleak outlook that you sort of proposed at the start. I recognise that all those things are happening, and we can't be blind to that. But we've also got to make sure that we have an optimistic view about our place in the world. We've been a country that has many people who said punched above its weight, all that sort of thing. We have a great democracy. We have an evolving democracy, and we have a deep love of the freedom that gives us. And so I think we've got a good domestic base to continue our engagement with the rest of the world. I think we should be very clear about protecting the values that we see as important, and that does mean sticking up for the Ukraine and for the rules-based system wherever it might be. But we've also got to recognise that we are a country that enjoys a lifestyle here far in advance of what any domestic economy alone could give us. We're a trading nation, and so we need to make sure that in our trading we're able to uphold that rules-based system while we promote our own values at the same time. I'm very optimistic about the opportunities for New Zealand in a world that might be starting to constrain itself a little bit.
That deserves a clap. Come on.
There's 2 minutes.
Golriz.
I think that if COVID taught us anything, it's that we cannot overcome any shared crisis unless we all overcome it together. And that should apply to our global affairs and the way that we approach the rules-based system. It should mean that we rethink the WTO rules, for example, around patents on vaccines. It should mean that we look at global debt and inequality, because actually it was the poorer nations that couldn't pull through in the same way that we could. It should mean that we acknowledge that the climate crisis means that we have to rethink those rules, because that is a shared crisis, and all of us have to come through it. It has to be climate justice. And we are in the Pacific, and the Pacific will be hit the hardest. So we can't afford oil subsidies anymore. We can't afford to do trade without looking at aid and debt. We can't afford to leave anyone behind, especially not in our region.
Okay.
if it was slightly
Well,
louder
look, for
than that.
ACT, our foreign policy thoughts are that we should be seeking to protect and to promote the values of freedom and democracy. That means in New Zealand, it means in the Pacific, and it means around the globe. We need to not only uphold our rights of freedom and our values here, but also to support other nations that come under threat. That's why we have strongly supported the Ukraine. That's why we strongly support Taiwan's ability to exist external to China. That's why we have spoken out freely about atrocities that happen in China. ACT Party brought a motion to suggest genocide was occurring in Xinjiang. We have spoken quite openly about the issues of freedom and the need to promote it, not just in New Zealand but internationally. That goes hand in hand also with trade. We have to trade because we are a trading nation. And that's the only way that we will grow wealth and grow prosperity for everybody so we can afford more as a country. So we do have to go looking for more trade allies and protect our own values.
Well, I started with a bleak view, so let me finish with take Gerry's point and finish with a slightly better one. We've had 3 incredible global shocks in the space of only a small number of years. We've had a global financial crisis, COVID, inflation, but actually we've come through them pretty okay. I mean, we're not going into big recessions. US is probably not going into recession. Inflation is starting to plateau. And globalisation, the positive sides of globalisation are still there. We're still connecting with ideas and there is still trade, as you say, Brooke. So there is reason to be hopeful. And one of the biggest reasons to be hopeful, actually, this panel tonight, I mean, these guys are going into the election. There's more that we share in common in terms of our values than divides us. We are not a polarised country. We feel like it, but I listen to everybody here and you can see there is more that the more that we agree on, and our values are shared values. So I'd be pretty happy with any of you guys in government, to be honest. So please give a round of applause to the panel and good luck for the election. To Sid and to NZIIA, Hamish and Peter, and please join us all for a drink and some nibbles out there, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.